Yirmiyahu who was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simchat to the dagim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we always do our best to bring a little joy to the world by talking about the prophets. Today we get to talk about Zechariah, whose final chapter we read for the first day of Sukkot. I'm Larry Herman, sipping some very fine wine and talking Haftarah with my very good friend, the king of cantillation, Rick Muller. How are you doing today, Rick?
I'm excited. We're getting ready for Sukkot. Great holiday, great Haftarah.
I certainly agree that it's a great holiday. My favorite. I love putting up the sukkah, decorating it, this year with my granddaughter Millie, and then eating all our meals there.
You mean you don't sleep there?
Rick, those days are long gone. I used to sleep in the sukkah with my kids when they are young, and maybe in the future with Millie, but for now, if I'm sleeping outdoors, it's going to be while camping in the mountains. But I'm going to challenge your claim that this is a great Haftarah, especially coming on the heels of Ha'azinu and the two Haftarot for Yom Kippur, all of which can truly be called great. I find the selection from the last chapter of Zechariah perplexing.
And what, pray tell, is your perplexation? It's clear why the sages chose this chapter for the Haftarah. There's three references to Chag HaSukkot in verses 16, 18, and 19. How can you top that?
Perplexation, great word. Rick, the problem isn't the reference per se. I acknowledge that this is the only explicit reference to the holiday of Sukkot in all of the books of the prophets. Although I will tell you that I would have preferred to have read from chapter 9 of Amos, where we have the verse, Bayom Ahu Akim et Sukkot David Hanufelet. On that day I will set up again the fallen sukkah of David.
Aha. And that line we add to benching on Sukkot.
Right. So it's not like the sages were unaware of that more uplifting reference.
And you're suggesting that the Haftarah from Zechariah is not uplifting? Besides, we read that verse from Amos as part of the Haftarah for Acharimot Kedoshim.
Reading a Haftarah twice is not a problem. We do that with the reading for the Shabbatot of Chanukah, which are also repeats of the Haftarot for Behalotecha and Vayakel. And we repeat the Haftarah for Ha'azinu on the seventh day of Pesach. And every year the Haftarah for Noach and Ki Titzei are the same. And the Sfardim read the same Haftarah for Shemot as for Matot. But yes, I'm suggesting that this Haftarah is not particularly uplifting.
There you go again with your Haftarah trivia.
I prefer Haftarivia, if we're going to continue to coin new words. But back to my point. Zechariah is prophesying during the reign of Darius in Persia. This was actually a pretty good time. The Jews, most likely including Zechariah, had returned from exile. Jerusalem was being rebuilt. They had a fair amount of political autonomy. And all of this is alluded to in the first chapters of Zechariah. But our chapter is pretty much a downer. As the Eitz Chaim commentary puts it, the Haftarah is marked by a strong tone of impending doom and purification. Rather than addressing the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the city appears under siege. In the second verse, we're told the city shall be captured. Worse, its houses plundered and its women violated. Is this the Haftarah for the joyous holiday of Sukkot or for Tisha B'Av?
Okay, I see your point. But you got to admit that there's an uplifting element in the text. God comes to protect the people. He does some pretty amazing stuff, like splitting the land from east to west, stopping up the valleys, creating a continuous day with no light or darkness, and causing water to flow from Jerusalem to both the Dead Sea and to the Mediterranean. And we've got one of the all-time great lines in all the Tanach. V'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz, v'yom hahu yiyeh Adonai echad Ushemo echad. And Adonai shall be king over all the earth. On that day, Adonai shall be one, and his name one.
All true. That line is familiar to everyone as the last line of the second paragraph of the Aleinu, which prophesizes the universal acceptance of God's sovereignty. But let's read on. Following that, we have a very graphic and unpleasant description of what will happen to our enemies. They are struck by plague. Their flesh shall rot as they stand on their feet. Their eyes shall rot in their sockets. Their tongues shall rot in their mouths. Even their animals will suffer. Listening to the Haftarah equivalent of some horror film is not my idea of what Sukkot should be about. I want something closer to Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony.
I get you, man. But the prophets weren't big into idyllic pastoralism. They were all about scaring the bejesus out of the people first. The good times come later. And you get the good times here, just not in the way you want. The enemies of Jerusalem will eventually bow to the Melech Adonai Tzvaot, the King, the Lord of hosts, and celebrate the festival of Sukkot. What could be better than that? Sukkot is like a huge Woodstock, dating both of us.
Okay, how about a big Coachella or Burning Man? But I get you, Rick. Still, intermixed with the somewhat forced universal celebration of Sukkot and acceptance of God is the threat to those who don't comply. They are punished. They don't get any rain, except for Egypt, which gets punished with plague. I want my Sukkot holiday to be filled with images of happiness and goodness.
Well, you got that, buddy. It's called Millie. But let's get to the trope and some of the things that I find interesting in the text.
Absolutely, Rick. Let's divide the chanting into two parts, which is pretty much the way the Masoretes divided it. We'll start with verses 1 through 11, which describe both the assault on Jerusalem by our enemies and God's fantastical defense of the city and the people. We'll conclude with verses 12 to 21, which include the triumphant verses that include the universal celebration of the Sukkot festival.
I like that. I get two relatively long, uninterrupted passages to chant. Most of what I want to talk about is in the first part of the Haftarah, but I'm sure we'll find something to discuss in part 2. So you know my method. I search for the rarest trope first.
Always.
There's no aser in the first part, but we do have a rare zarka, sigol, in verse 2 on the word Jerusalem, Yerushalaim. And I noticed there's no yud in the word at the end, anywhere. There's no yud. It's not spelled the way I think Yerushalaim is supposed to be spelled. It's still pronounced Yerushalaim. This is called the chaser form, meaning that it lacks a letter, which is fairly common. You just have to know how to pronounce it. And then I see the same thing in verse 4, and then again in verse 8, and again and again and again, 10 times. All of them spelled chaser without the yud. And then we talked about it, and you did a search, and what do you know? Almost all the times Yerushalaim is mentioned in the Tanach, it's written chaser, and I never noticed that.
Right. I checked on Zechariah and found that of the more than 600 times Jerusalem is written in the Tanakh, there are only 5 occasions when it's written Malay, meaning you add the Yud. Once in Jeremiah, once in Esther, and 3 times in Chronicles. I haven't found any good explanations, but there's a drash there, I'm sure.
I'm sure too. Now, if I can get back to my...
In a minute. Now, in the places where the Tanakh is written without vowels, it's not a problem, like in the Torah. Although Yerushalaim doesn't appear in the Torah at all. But where we have vowels, the printers have to worry about where to put the chirik, or the dot, for the E vowel. If you look at your Chumash, you'll see that they sneak it in there on the right side of the final mem.
Now you're really in the weeds. Since when do you know the difference between a chirik and a tzera? All I wanted to point out was that Jerusalem, with or without the yud, is the dominant theme in the Haftarah, just like Jerusalem is the dominant theme in Judaism. It represents more than just the geographic city. It's an ideal of holiness, of peace, of the relationship between the people and God. Zechariah knows that we yearn for Jerusalem, not only as the holy city, but also as a metaphor for our idealized relationship with God.
There you go, Rick. You gave us the drash. So maybe the yud is missing because the yud must be jointly inserted by us and God.
Now that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if I could go on. I'm still looking at verse 2 here, where we have an example of kativ and kri, what's written compared to what you say. And the word tisha chavna is what you should say and not say tisha galna, which is actually written there. Notice that Rabbi Ben Asher and the Masoretes replaced the word for rape or for violate, tisha galna, with a softer word for having sexual relations, which means to sleep with. The same thing happens in Parsha Ki Tavo, by the way, as part of the curses, where Yisha Galna is replaced by Yishkavena.
Maybe the Masoretes softened the Hebrew, but the translators were having none of that. The JPS translates it as, and the women were violated, where Alter writes, and the women were ravished.
You've already mentioned the famous verse 9 and its connection to the Aleinu. I like the comment in the Eitz Chaim on the bottom of page there of 1254, where they explain that there's a connection also to the Shema with the words Adonai Echad.
Okay, I can see that.
Wait a second. When we were discussing this earlier, you gave me a hard time. You said that there's no pasuk here, like in the Shema.
Yeah.
But the Shema focuses on our God, while this verse here talks about the universal acceptance of God.
All true. But if you want me to give you a hard time, I'll be happy.
Never mind. Now in verse 11, I've got a bone to pick with the JPS translation.
That's usually my job.
Yeah, but give me a moment here. I want to explain the connection. First, remember that pazer at the end of Jonah on the words yesh ba that we just read on Yom Kippur.
Yeah, I remember.
So when I got to verse 11 and I saw the phrase v'yashvuva, I got excited. There was a connection there. Yesh ba, yashvuva. And I saw that it didn't have a pazer, but it did have that lone munach zakef katon without the usual mapach pashta lead in. And I've told you before, I have a secondary theory about this, that it's significant. It signifies a big pronouncement, like in the Shema. V'ahavta is all concentrated on that one word. And it's all over the Torah, man. It's an educational thing. So here we have v'yashvuva, which everyone knows means, and they shall sit within her. Who's the her? Could be Jerusalem, as we've already discussed, or maybe it's the Sukkah, because this is Sukkot.
Right. That's exactly Alter's translation. He writes, and they shall dwell within her, and no more shall there be devastation.
That's what I'm saying, man. But what does the JPS give us? Never again shall destruction be decreed. They skipped the whole v'yashvuva part, and that's the important part. What's wrong with them?
That's what I've been telling you, Rick.
Okay. How about if I start chanting?
Good idea. The text is found in the Eitz Chaim Chumash on page 1253. You can also follow along on your screens with the beautifully formatted and illustrated text prepared by Norm. And I just want to mention what a fantastic job Norm did with the text for Jonah. Kol hakavod.
Absolutely. And I especially love the cartoon that he found of Noah inside the belly of the whale watching TV. Just great. Now the bracha.
Okay.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Hine yom ba l'Adonai v'chulak shlalech v'kirbech ve'asafti et kol hagoyim El Yerushalaim la milchama v'nilkeda ha'ir v'nashasu habatim v'hanashim tishachavna v'yatsa chatzi ha'ir v'agola v'yeter ha'am lo yikaret min ha'ir. V'yatsa Adonai v'nilcham b'goyim ahem keyom hilachamo v'yom karav v'amdu raglav v'yom hahu al har hazetim asher al pnei Yerushalaim mikedem v'nivka har hazetim mechetzyo mizracha v'yama gedola me'od umash chatzi hahar tzafona v'chetzyo negba v'nastem geharai ki yagia geharim el atzal v'nastem kasher nastem mipnei harash bimei Uzziah melech Yehuda uva Adonai Elohai kol kedoshim imach v'haya bayom hahu lo yeh or yekarot v'kipaon v'haya yom echad hu yivada l'Adonai lo yom v'lo layla v'haya le'et erev yiyeh or v'haya bayom hahu yetzu mayim chayim miYerushalayim chetz yam el hayam hakadmoni v'chetz yam el hayam hacharon b'kayitz u'b'choref yiyeh v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz bayom hahu yiyeh Adonai echad u'shmo echad yisov kol haaretz karava migeva l'rimon negev Yerushalaim v'ra'ama v'yashva tachteha l'misha'ar binyamin ad mekom sha'ar harishon ad sha'ar hapinim u'migdal chananel ad yikveh hamelech v'yashvu vach v'cherem lo yiyeh od v'yashva Yerushalayim lavetach.
Rick, you said that you didn't have much to say in the second part of the Haftarah.
No, I just said that most of what I wanted to say was in the first part. But I want to call attention to some of the trope in this part. Starting with verse 12 here, we have a munach lagarme, followed by a revia on v'zot tiyeh hamagefa, and this shall be the plague. The emphasis is intentional. It's a warning. This is followed by another pasuk, same verse, hamek bisaro, their flesh shall rot, with a dramatic pause between the verb and the noun.
Given that in Hebrew the verb comes before the noun here, the effect is more dramatic. First comes shall rot, then the pause, leading us to wonder what will decay or what rot. Their flesh, yuch.
And in the next verse, we have a dargat tavir, antiyeh mehumat Adonai. There will be a panic from Adonai, as if the panic is falling from the heavens. In verse 14, we have your favorite Kadma v'Azla on ve'usaf chel kol hagoyim, and the wealth of the nations shall be gathered in.
Rick, I have an interesting trope and translation observation. In verse 16, which happens to be where we first see mention of Chag HaSukkot, we have Va'alu midei shana v'shana. First, the literal translation that Alter uses is, and they shall go up year after year. But JPS uses, shall make a pilgrimage in place of go up. I like the Gershayim on the word Va'alu, because it kind of sounds like struggling up a hill to get to Jerusalem.
Yeah, very interesting. Especially since in the next verse, the same verb, olah, ayin lamed hey, gets special treatment with a kadma v'azla. V'haya asher lo ya'aleh. And for those who do not go up, the going up is important. And there's a third example in verse 18 with a dargat tavir again on Mitzrayim lo ta'aleh, referring to the Egyptians who failed to go up.
Rick, it's time for us to go on with the chanting, starting with verse 12.
Vezot tieh hamagefa asher yigof Adonai ekol ha'amim asher tzavu al Yerushalaim hamek besaro vehu omed al raglav ve'enav timakna v'chorehen ulshono timak befihem v'haya bayom ahu tiyeh mehumat Adonai rabba bahem v'cheziku ish yadrehu ve'alta yado al yad re'ehu ve'gam Yehuda tilachem Yerushalaim ve'usaf chel kol goy hagoyim saviv zahav v'chesef uvgadim larov meod V'chen tiyeh magefat hasus hapered hagamal v'hachamor v'chol habema asher yiyeh b'machanot hahema kamagefa hazot v'haya kol hanotar Mikol hagoyim haba'im al Yerushalaim ve'alu midei shana v'shana lishtachavot lemelech Adonai tzvaot ve'lachog et chag hasukot ve'aya Asher lo ya'aleh meit mishpachot haaretz el Yerushalaim lehishtachavot lemelech Adonai tzvaot velo alehem yeh hagashem b'mishpachat Mitzrayim lo taleh V'lo va'a, v'lo alehem, tiyeh hamagefa, asher yigof Adonai et hagoyim, asher lo ya'alu, lachog et chag HaSukkot. Zot tiyeh chatat Mitzrayim, v'chatat Kol hagoyim asher lo yalu lachog et chag HaSukkot vayom ahu yiyeh ametzilot asus kodesh Ladonai, V'haya hasirot beveit Adonai, kamizrakim lifnei hamizbeach, V'haya kol sir b'Yerushalaim u'v'Yehuda, Kodesh Ladonai Tzvaot, Uva'u Kol Azovachim, V'lachu mehem, Uv'ishlu vahem, V'lo yiyeh Chena'ani od, Beveit Adonai Tzvaot, V'yom ha'u.
Okay, a little uplifting. As always, thanks to Norm Gar for all the beautiful graphics, music, text, and editing. Don't forget to write us with your thoughts and comments. Our emails are below. And if you like our Zoom cast, please forward the link to your family and friends. We'll be back next week with an episode for Shmini Atzeret. In the meantime, we wish you all a Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.